Hello everyone, Kibler here, and today I want to share with you my top 5 cards from the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan expansion. The expansion is, well, very nearly here. Will be released later today, and this is sort of my thoughts on maybe what cards you should craft, what cards you should really look for in your packs, and maybe try to build some decks around, because I think these are going to be some of the most impactful cards from the new set. So let's start things off at number 5, which I think is probably the most controversial of the cards on this list, and it is Small Time Buccaneer. This may seem like a strange card to choose, one of my top cards in the set, but this is a card that I think is very, very powerful for the decks that want to play it. We've seen quite a few cards that can support the pirate themes in both Warrior and in Rogue. And Small Time Buccaneer can fit into either of those decks, and it is just a very powerful, aggressive minion, even if you're not necessarily playing a pirate deck, even if you're just playing a weapon-centric deck. A 3/2 minion for just 1 mana is very strong when you're pushing aggressively for damage, and in some cases, many of these decks, that's exactly what they're missing. They're missing a way to really consistently put on pressure in the early game, and this is a card that puts on a lot of pressure. Those of you who played during the Goblin vs. Gnomes expansion may remember Cogmaster and how powerful draws that included Cogmaster often were in terms of the pressure they put in your opponent. And Small Time Buccaneer is very, very similar to that and will enable those decks to have that very aggressive push that they can help finish off with charged minions or direct damage or just those weapons that they're using to enable the Buccaneer. I think that there's a lot of warrior decks that can easily enable this early on, whether it's with Fiery War Axe or N'Zoth's First Mate or whatever else, while Rogue obviously just has access to its hero power if it's going to power this up in the early game. So I definitely think that this is kind of a little bit of a sleeper card because it hasn't been a card that I've heard a lot of people talking about, but is one of the cards that I think is likely to make a very big impact on the constructed scene. Next up, we have Rat Pack. Rat Pack is a card that is powerful kind of on its own. This is a 2/2 beast for 3, which by itself obviously not like hugely impactful, but if it dies, gives you 2 beasts. And that's very strong, particularly where it is on the curve for what hunters are looking to do. Houndmaster is iconically one of the very powerful hunter cards that beast-based hunter decks use to have swing turns in the middle turns of the game. And Rat Pack is one of the best ways to enable that because it is coming down right on curve before Houndmaster and will give you almost certainly beasts remaining in play to pump it up with the Houndmaster. If your opponent doesn't kill your Rat Pack, you're able to Houndmaster the Rat Pack itself, which gives you even more rats when it dies. And if they do kill it, well, at least you have a rat left over to pump and get that sort of big tempo swing on the board. This is all just talking about Rat Pack naturally, without any kind of influence from the Grimy Goons hand buffing cards. There are multiple cards that can give this as much as +2/+2, +4/+4 in the early turns of the game, and that can be an absolutely huge Rat Pack to have to deal with all of the rats that are likely to scurry out afterwards. So definitely a very powerful card, certainly somewhat vulnerable to the popularity of Maelstrom Portal in the metagame, considering shamans can just attack into it and then wipe away the rats, but it does require them to potentially use multiple cards or at least react in a way that they don't want to have to use their mana at that stage of the game in order to kill just a 3-drop minion. So very powerful card and one that I expect will show up in a lot of hunter decks. Next up, we have Dragonfire Potion. This is probably no surprise to any of those who watch my stream or watch my videos for a long time. I'm obviously a huge fan of not just dragon decks, but priest decks as well. And Dragonfire Potion is a card that has the potential to be very impactful in a wide range of different priest decks. It's obviously very strong if you're playing a dragon priest deck because it can often be just basically a flame strike that kills all your opponent's minions but leaves your dragons unscathed. But it's also a card that can just kind of replace Light Bomb in a lot of control priest decks just to give you a way to clear off the board. Priest decks are sort of notoriously poor at dealing with middle-sized boards these days. I've gone so far as playing multiple copies of Excavated Evil and Holy Nova and Blood Mage Thalnos in decks just to have ways to kill your opponent's significant boards. And that can be a big problem. Of course, Dragonfire Potion doesn't really leave you with the ability to kill some of the most powerful and most frustrating minions against the priest deck. Things like Twilight Drake or Azure Drake. These are 4 attack minions that happen to also be dragons. So Dragonfire Potion won't give you the tools to deal with that, but it can deal with boards full of Gadgetzan Auctioneers and totems and all sorts of other things. Thing from below that really just can give you big trouble if you're playing a priest deck and really trying to play control. So even if you're not playing Dragon Priest, Dragonfire Potion is a really powerful card in your arsenal, and I expect I'll be playing tons of it in the near future, and I'm sure I won't be the only one. Next up we have what I think is the strongest of the gang leaders. Maybe I'm a little bit biased just because of the classes that I personally like to play, but it's Kazakh. And this is a card that obviously can only go into a smaller range of decks, not just the Cabal classes, but also effectively Reno style decks in those classes. But this is a very, very strong card. One of the hallmarks of any card that has powerful applications in Hearthstone is not only its raw power, but also its versatility. How good is it when you're ahead? How good is it when you're behind? What sort of options does it give you? And Kazakh is a card that obviously has tons of options. This is a card that you can play in the early game and try and find ways to get back on the board with the spells that you get from it. You can also play it late in the game and get very powerful ways to just seal the game or make it more difficult for your opponent to come back if you are ahead, or just give you sort of an insurance policy that you can wipe the board and continue to survive in a game that's going long. And that combination of flexibility and power makes Kazakh an incredible standout card that I think is very likely to not only find a home in Reno Warlock decks, which are a powerful archetype right now, but even inspire additional Reno-style control decks in both Priest and in Mage. There's obviously other cards that encourage this, like the Priest and Mage legendary cards, but I think that Kazakh is going to be a big part of that for both of those classes, simply because it does offer so much power and flexibility from a single card. And my number 1 card from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan, and I was actually very hesitant to name this card the number 1 card, because I know it seems very biased of me in terms of the style of decks that I enjoy and whatnot, but I was looking through all the cards, and really nothing stood out to me as being nearly as impactful as Draconid Operative. Now, this is obviously a much narrower card in application to pretty much any of the ones that we've talked about earlier. This is only good in Dragon Priest. But this card is so good in Dragon Priest that I think it really puts it over the top compared to all the other cards. This is everything that Dragon Priest has wanted for so long. It is a 5-drop dragon that is actually powerful on the board. The 5/6 body is a huge deal for Priest decks. One of the big problems with Priest, and specifically Dragon Priest, is its inability to actually have competitive minions on the board a lot of the time. You have, obviously in the early turns, you have these overstated things like Wormrest Agent or Blackwing Technician or Twilight Guardian, but then you kind of start petering out in terms of your minion size. Azure Drake was a card that was pretty much always played in Dragon Priest simply because you needed to fill out your curve and you needed dragons and there were no other options. And as awesome as Azure Drake may be in general, it was by far the weakest card in Dragon Priest decks because it kept you from being able to actually play a minion that could contest the board at that point. You really lost the board around the point that you were forced to start playing Azure Drakes every time you're playing Dragon Priest. And as someone who's played a lot of Dragon Priest, I know this. I assure you, this is just kind of how a lot of the games worked. You got to that point and you're like, okay, well, I'll play this Azure Drake, and then your opponent gets ahead, and your deck was terrible at playing from behind because you don't have really any great ways to catch up on the board once that happens. You obviously have, Bookworm and Blackwing Corruptor, and these are kind of ways to maneuver and kill, small to medium things. But when your opponent just played a big thing in the middle turns of the game or several big things, you just really fell behind. And between Draconid and Operative giving you the ability to stay ahead at that stage of the game and Dragonfire Potion giving you the ability to come back when your opponent plays a gigantic board, I think Dragon Priest is going to be very much the real deal. And the funny thing is, I've just talked about the stats. All I've talked about is the fact that Draconid Operative is a 5/6 dragon for 5. It also has an ability. It has the ability to discover a card from your opponent's deck. And this gives Dragon Priest not only significant flexibility because it's giving you discover options. You get information about your opponent's deck. You get to figure out what card might be best in a given situation. It's also providing card advantage, which is something that Azure Drake previously did, but it had a pretty steep cost. And you might be saying, well, Azure Drake gave spell damage too. That can power up Holy Nova. Holy Nova has been garbage for a long time, and it's only a card that you played because you basically had to, because there was no other good way. If you fell behind playing a priest deck, playing Dragon Priest in particular, that you could really get back into the game. And the Azure Drake plus Holy Nova combination at 10 mana to be able to kill your opponent's board of totems and feral spirits, that wasn't really something that made Dragon Priest powerful. It was just kind of a desperation thing. You're like, okay, I hope I can make it here, and you never really did. So, but Draconid Operative, you get access to potentially your opponent's removal spells, your opponent's threats, and it does so without costing you cards in your deck. Which, when you're playing a priest deck that can potentially go long against, say, a control warrior deck and end up in fatigue, you often were actually unable to play Azure Drake late in the game because the threat of fatiguing was very real. But Draconid Operative gives you that card advantage, gives you that ability to potentially generate additional threats, additional answers, without actually digging you further through your deck, so you're not at risk of fatiguing in the same way. And Bran was already pretty good in modern iterations of Dragon Priest because of its interaction with Blackwing Corruptor and with Netherspite Historian, and it's so awesome with Draconid Operative because you are gaining just additional incremental advantages when you have Bran plus Operative, and you're not costing yourself the threat of fatigue. I think that between Draconid Operative and Wrathion, which is in my top 5 in my heart, but I don't think legitimately a top 5 card in the set, Dragon Priest can now play sort of an attrition style of game without having to play Northshire Cleric. Northshire Cleric has always been a card that is very awkward, not always, but recently been a card that's been very awkward in any priest deck, but even in Dragon Priest where you have lots of minions, simply because the format really selects against it. There's lots of easy ways for opponents to kill it early on. It matches up very poorly against Spirit Claws, against Lightning Bolt, against Totem Golem, against most of the minions that see play. Frankly, there's not the 2/1s for 1 it used to prey upon anymore, and those that do exist are things like Fiery Bat, which can just straight up kill it. So being able to have tools that give you card advantage and allow you to play an attrition style of game in the matchups where you need to without having to run Northshire Cleric is huge for Dragon Priest decks, and that's true of Operative and Wrathion, and I really think that combination is going to catapult Dragon Priest to be a top competitive deck. So I'm looking forward to that, and I know some of those people out there who feel the same way as me are too. So anyway, that's my top 5 cards from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. Let me know what you think in the comments. I know that there's going to be people in the comments who are raging about how I missed Jade Idol and, what am I thinking? And I'm still going to, stick to my initial review of that card and say that I think it's the most overrated card in the set, which I think still means it can be good, but definitely still overrated. I think that the world is going to come to realize I'm right in this one eventually. Maybe they won't. Maybe even if exactly what I think plays out does play out and the card's just good but not unbelievable and totally invalidates control archetypes, that people will be like, you were wrong! But everyone's going to tell you you're wrong on the internet. So anyway, thanks for watching, and like I said, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Have fun with Mean Streets of Gadgetzan.